What if the life you'd carved out with your own hands, 30 years of sweat, grease, and unrelenting grit, was snatched away in a single, gut-wrenching breath? Picture this. A cramped garage, air thick with the tang of motor oil and the hiss of burning rubber, tools clattering like a heartbeat against the concrete. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Welcome to Daily Narrated Stories, where we peel back the layers of ordinary lives to reveal the extraordinary battles beneath. Meet Mike Carter, 58 years old. His weathered hands trembling not from age but from a fire reigniting deep within. For 3 decades, he'd stood under the hood of an old Chevy, wiping sweat from his brow, the grime etching lines into his skin like a map of his sacrifice. This wasn't a job, it was his soul's rhythm. The roar of engines his lullaby since he first stepped into Carter's auto repair as a boy with dreams bigger than the rusted toolbox he carried. Can you hear it? The hum of a life built piece by piece, bolt by bolt? Mike wasn't just a mechanic, he was the mechanic. The one who could close his eyes, listen to an engine stutter, and name its ailment like a doctor reading a pulse. He'd forged this garage's reputation from nothing, turning a dusty corner shop into a name people trusted. A name they whispered with relief when their cars faltered. Every dented fender he'd smoothed, every late night he'd spent coaxing life back into a dying motor. It was his offering to a world that rarely looked twice. At 58, his back ached, his knees creaked, but his hands danced with a precision time couldn't dull. Yet to Frank Carter, the man who owned the garage and shared his name but not his heart, Mike was invisible. A shadow moving through the oil-slicked haze, a tool to be used and discarded. Frank never thanked him, not once. No nod for the countless evenings Mike lingered past dusk, unpaid. His only reward the soft glow of a customer's taillights fading into the night, safe because of him. Instead, Frank's voice cut through the garage like a dull blade, sharp enough to wound, careless enough to sting. Fix this. Move faster. Don't screw up. Mike was a cog, a rusty gear in Frank's machine, interchangeable and forgettable. For 30 years, Mike swallowed it. Every barked order, every missed chance to ask for more. His loyalty was a quiet fortress, unshaken by the storms of Frank's disdain. Have you ever given everything to something or someone, only to realize they never saw you? That's where Mike stood, teetering on the edge of a cliff he didn't yet know existed. The air shifted one muggy afternoon, heavy with the promise of rain and something darker. Mike was elbow-deep in a Chevy's guts, the engine's growl a familiar friend, when a snatch of conversation pierced the haze. Frank's voice, smug and careless, drifted from the office. Starting Monday, $20 an hour, bonuses for efficiency. Mike's hands stilled, grease dripping onto the concrete like black tears. $20? He'd never seen more than $10 an hour. Not in 3 decades. No raises, no bonuses, just the same worn paycheck that barely stretched to the end of the month. His breath hitched as he peered through the grimy window. Frank clapped a young kid on the back. A boy with soft hands and a cocky grin, too green to know a spark plug from a socket wrench. Mike's wrench slipped, clanging against the floor, a gunshot in the quiet. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening under the grime. 30 years, 30 damn years, of dawn to dusk labor, of skipping meals to finish jobs, of pouring his youth into this place. And this kid was worth double? The garage spun, the walls closing in, each clank of metal now a taunt. He could still smell his first day here, the sharp bite of gasoline, the thrill of possibility. Back then, Frank had been a friend, a gruff older brother promising they'd build something together. Now that promise lay shattered, a rusted relic beneath the kid's smug laughter. Think about it, what would you feel if the one thing you'd given your all to turned its back on you? Betrayal? Rage? Or something deeper? Something that whispers in the dark? Suspense coiled tight, a storm brewing in Mike's chest. This wasn't just about money, it was about worth, about the decades he'd traded for loyalty only to be deemed disposable. The kid's voice grated, bragging about some college course he'd barely passed, while Frank nodded like he'd found gold. Mike's mind raced. Every late night, every callous scar, every time he told himself it was enough to be needed. Was it all for nothing? The air grew electric, the hum of the garage now a dirge for a life he'd let slip through his fingers. At Daily Narrated Stories, we live for these moments, the crossroads where ordinary men face extraordinary choices. Stay with us, because Mike's next step will leave you breathless. Let's rewind for a heartbeat. Mike wasn't always this shadow of resilience. As a kid, he dreamed of racing cars, not just fixing them. His bedroom walls plastered with posters of sleek Ferraris tearing through sunlit tracks, the roar of engines a siren call to a life of speed. Life had other plans. A father lost to illness when Mike was 14, a mother drowning in bills, and a teenage Mike dropping out to keep the lights on. Carter's auto repair had been his lifeline, Frank his anchor. A rough-edged man who'd tossed him a wrench and said, "You'll do." Over the years, that anchor rusted, dragging him down while Frank rose. Now, standing in the garage he'd built with his own hands, Mike felt the weight of those lost dreams pressing against his ribs, a dull ache that sharpened with every word Frank spoke to the kid. What happens when the boy who dreamed of speed becomes the man told he's too slow? Maybe you've been there, chasing a dream only to wake up years later wondering where it went. That's Mike's story, and maybe it's yours too. Mike stormed toward Frank's office, boots slamming the concrete like thunder rolling across a storm-swept plain, his pulse a wild drumbeat drowning out the engines he'd spent a lifetime taming. The door loomed ahead, chipped and weathered, a battered sentinel that had stood silent through decades of his unspoken devotion. Inside, Frank sprawled behind a desk littered with coffee stains, cigarette butts, and unpaid invoices. A throne of chaos for a man who ruled with apathy. Mike didn't knock. Courtesy was a luxury he'd long outgrown. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, voice rough as gravel, each syllable a shard of pent-up fury. Frank barely lifted his eyes from his mug, the steam curling like a smirk. "What? The new kid? You're paying him more than me?" Mike spat, the words tasting of bile. "I've given you 30 years, 30 damn years, of my life, Frank." Frank set his mug down with a deliberate clink, the sound sharp against the hum of the garage, and leaned back with a sigh that oozed condescension. "Listen, Mike, the kid's young, fast, got energy I can use. I need fresh hands. You're not what you used to be." The words landed like a sledgehammer, splintering the fragile pride Mike had clung to through every late night and aching joint. His chest constricted, breath shallow, as memories surged. Nights under flickering bulbs fixing cars while his kids slept miles away, missing their first steps, their school plays, all for this place. "I don't take sick days," he growled, voice trembling with a rage he'd buried too long. "I don't leave a job half done. I've never." Frank cut him off with a lazy wave, smirking through yellowed teeth. "Sure, but let's face it, you're slowing down. If you don't like it, there's the door." Mike's jaw locked, a muscle twitching under the strain, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from a clarity so piercing it sliced through 30 years of fog. The office reeked of stale coffee and betrayal, the walls a gallery of faded photos. Him and Frank in better days, grinning over a rebuilt Mustang, promises of partnership long rusted away. All those extra hours, the weekends he'd traded for nothing, the dreams he'd let wither. They flickered like a dying film reel, each frame a sacrifice for a man who saw him as less than dust. Mike didn't shout, didn't beg. He turned, boots heavy as lead, each step a requiem for the boy who'd once believed in this place. At his workbench, he set his wrench down, a soft, mournful clang, the final note of a song he'd played too long. The garage held its breath, tools glinting in the dim light like mourners at a funeral. He peeled off his uniform, grease-stained and threadbare, folding it with hands that trembled from decades of toil, not sentiment. The fabric carried the scent of his life, oil, sweat, and unspoken loyalty, and he placed it on the counter like an offering to a god who'd never answered. He cast a last look at the shop, his shop, in every bolt he'd tightened, every engine he'd nursed back to life. The door creaked shut behind him, sealing 3 decades in a silence so thick it pressed against his ribs. His co-workers froze, tools limp in their hands, jaws slack, eyes wide with disbelief. Mike Carter didn't quit. He was the rock they'd all leaned on, the steady hand that pulled them through floods, breakdowns, and Frank's tantrums. From his office, Frank smirked, sipping his coffee with a smugness that curdled the air. "He'll crawl back," he muttered, voice dripping with arrogance. "Give it a week, he's got nowhere else." Suspense coiled tight. Where could a man like Mike, 58, no degree, no cushion, possibly go? That night, Mike sat at his kitchen table, a single bulb swaying overhead, casting jagged shadows across an envelope of crumpled bills. His life savings, a pitiful harvest from 30 years of breaking his back. His hands, rough as the asphalt he'd driven 1,000 times, traced the edges, each crease a scar of a job finished, unthanked. The house creaked around him, a hollow shell echoing with the ghosts of a life spent serving Frank's greed. He saw his wife's face. Ellen, gone 5 years now, her soft smile fading as he'd come home late again, too tired to talk, too drained to dream. She'd believed in him, whispered he was more than this, but he'd stayed, tethered by duty. Now, alone with his regrets, a spark flickered. Not despair, but a whisper of freedom, fragile yet fierce. For the first time, no one owned his dawn. Have you ever sat with your own worth, staring down the years you've given away? Mike did, and what he chose next will haunt you. Dawn broke, gray and relentless, painting the world in shades of steel. But Mike rose with a fire he hadn't felt since he was 18. Racing borrowed cars down back roads, dreaming of speed. He didn't trudge to Carter's auto repair, didn't let habit pull him back. Instead, he drove to a forsaken lot on the town's edge. A shack with peeling paint, its rusted sign swaying like a hanged man in the wind. The air smelled of decay and possibility, and he paid the first month's rent in cash, hands trembling not from doubt but from the weight of a new beginning. He scavenged tools from an auction, wrenches worn smooth by other hands, a torch that sparked like his resolve, and hammered up a sign, Carter's Custom Repairs. It was a fledgling empire rising from the ashes of betrayal, a phoenix too stubborn to die. The first days were a brutal crucible, silence where engines should have roared. No clients, no lifeline but his own grit. The shack creaked under the weight of his gamble, the wind whistling through cracked windows like a taunt. Doubt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. Had he traded one prison for another? He stood amid his silent tools, hands on hips, staring at the empty lot as shadows lengthened. Friends had called him crazy. His sister, Mary, had begged him to stay safe, to not risk what little he had. "You're 58, Mike," she'd said, voice cracking over the phone. Her worry a tether he'd gently untied. "What if you fail?" He'd hugged her last Sunday, promised he'd be fine. But now, alone, her words echoed. Had he bet too much on a dream the world had forgotten? Suspense thickened. What would become of this man who dared to leap? Then came the growl, a deep, luxurious rumble that shattered the stillness, a sound that pulled Mike from his spiral like a lifeline tossed into dark waters. A Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled in, black as a moonless night, its engine coughing like a beast choking on its own blood. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped out, frustration etched into his sharp features, his polished shoes incongruous against the gravel. "Something's wrong," he muttered, tapping the hood with a manicured hand. "3 garages couldn't fix it. Wasted my damn time." Mike wiped his hands on a rag, eyeing the car with a hunger that hadn't stirred in years. It wasn't just metal and gears, it was a challenge, a dare to prove he still had it. "Pop the hood," he said, voice steady as bedrock. The man hesitated, skepticism flickering in his steel-gray eyes. "You sure? No offense, but—" Mike smirked, a glint of defiance sparking. 2 days. Trust me." The keys hit his palm with a weight that felt like fate, and Mike dove in, the shack's dim light his only witness. Day bled into night, the hours blurring as he tore into the engine, researched the model until his vision swam, chased every lead with a ferocity that surprised even him. Other mechanics had failed, scratched their heads, sent the car back limping. But Mike saw deeper, his hands moving with an instinct honed by decades. It wasn't a piston or a valve, It was a ghost in the wiring, an electrical fault buried deep in the computer system, a riddle most shops couldn't unravel. He worked through the second night, coffee cold, back screaming, driven by a need to prove, not just to the man but to himself, that 30 years hadn't dulled his edge. 3 days later, the owner returned, arms crossed, doubt carved into his stance like a permanent scowl. Mike met his gaze, turned the key, and the rolls purred, smooth, alive, a symphony of triumph that echoed off the shack's walls. The man's jaw dropped, eyes widening as if he'd seen magic. "How?" he breathed, voice trembling with awe. Mike shrugged, hiding a grin that threatened to split his face. 30 years of listening to what others miss. The man stared, then pulled out a checkbook, scribbling a number that made Mike's breath catch, triple what he'd planned to charge. He pressed it into Mike's hand with a handshake that lingered, firm and reverent. "You're a rare find," he said, voice low with promise. "My friends, people like me, will pay for this. They're coming." Word spread like wildfire through the town's whispered networks, a murmur among the wealthy that grew into a roar. Within a week, Mike's shack buzzed, Bentleys gliding in, Ferraris snarling, Lamborghinis purring for the man who fixed the unfixable. Money flowed, not a trickle but a torrent, washing away decades of scraping by. He hired a kid from the auction, Tommy, a wiry 19-year-old with oil in his veins and a grin that reminded Mike of himself at that age. Tommy's dad had walked out, left him to fend for a sick mom. Mike saw the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger he'd once carried. "You're good," Mike told him, clapping his shoulder after watching him tear apart a carburetor with surgical precision. "Stick with me, you'll go far." Tommy beamed, and Mike felt something shift, a legacy taking root. 2 weeks after walking away, Mike made a choice that would reverberate through the town. He bought a Ferrari, red as fresh blood, sleek as a predator stalking the night, and aimed it straight for Carter's auto repair. The engine's growl tore through the streets, a war cry that turned heads and quickened pulses, a sound that carried the weight of his defiance. Suspense built. What would Frank do when he saw this? The Ferrari glided into the lot, sunlight igniting its curves, a phoenix risen from the ashes of Mike's past. The garage fell deathly still. Wrenches froze mid-turn, tires slipped from trembling hands, the air crackling with unspoken questions. Mike let the engine idle, its rumble a challenge, a dare to the man who'd cast him aside. Frank stepped out, face paling as if he'd seen his own ghost, his coffee mug trembling in his grip. For weeks, he'd mocked Mike, regaling the crew with tales of his inevitable failure. "He'll be back, begging," he'd sneered, laughing over beers at the dive bar down the road. Now, here was a car worth more than his crumbling empire, driven by the man he'd called washed up. Mike stepped out, dressed sharper than ever, new jacket, boots polished, a stark contrast to the grease-stained shadow he'd been. The air thickened, tension snapping like a live wire. "This yours?" Frank stammered, voice stripped of its usual venom, cracking under the weight of disbelief. Mike smoothed his jacket, letting the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, his eyes locking with Frank's in a stare that spoke volumes. "You called me washed up?" Mike said, voice low, laced with a cold fire that burned through the years. "This washed-up mechanic made more in 2 weeks than you did all year." Frank's laugh was brittle, a desperate wheeze that died in his throat. "Mike, listen, I was hard on you. 30 years we're family, right? Come back. Name your price, shop manager, bonuses, anything." His words tumbled out, frantic, a drowning man grasping at driftwood. Mike chuckled, but it was pity, not rage, that colored his tone. A pity born of seeing Frank's empire unravel. He reached into the Ferrari, pulling out his old uniform, faded, stained with the sweat of decades, and held it up, letting the crew see the relic of his servitude. Then he tossed it at Frank's feet, a soft thud that echoed louder than any shout. "I'm not your employee anymore," he said, steady as granite. "I'm a boss." Turning to the mechanics, his old crew, faces he'd known through every oil spill and late-night rush, He asked, "Ever get a raise?" Heads shook, slow and heavy, eyes darting to Frank with unease. "Ever get thanked for the nights you stayed late? The jobs you finished when he wouldn't?" Silence answered, thick with realization. "When you're tired of being underpaid, undervalued, you know where I am." A murmur rippled through them. Jake, the quiet one who'd fixed transmissions with surgical precision. Lou, the grizzled vet who'd taught Mike half his tricks. Their gazes shifted, questioning, as Mike slid back into the Ferrari. Frank lunged forward, face red with desperation. "Mike, wait!" But the engine roared, tires screeching as the car shot forward, leaving Frank choking on dust and his workers whispering rebellion. The tide had turned, but how far would it sweep, and who would follow? 6 months later, Carter's Custom Repairs thrummed with life. A symphony of engines, Ferraris and Porsches lining the lot like a gallery of power. Mike stood at its heart, hands on hips, watching his empire rise from the rubble of his past. The shack was gone, replaced by a gleaming workshop, spotless floors, walls lined with tools that shone like metals. Calls flooded in, celebrities with private jets, CEOs with car collections, collectors begging for his touch, waiting weeks for a slot with the man who turned impossibility into art. Tommy thrived beside him, hands quick and sure, his mom's medical bills shrinking with every paycheck Mike signed. "You saved me," Tommy said one night, voice thick as they locked up, the stars piercing the dark above. Mike just nodded. Salvation ran both ways. Then came Jake, stepping from a battered pickup one crisp morning, his face a map of weariness and wonder. He'd been Mike's shadow at Frank's, steady, silent, a master of engines who'd never complained. Now he stood in the lot, eyes darting between the gleaming cars and Mike's calm figure. "Frank's shop. It's dying," Jake said, voice low, hesitant. "Hours cut, wages slashed. Half the crew's gone. Lou walked last week. I should have followed you that day you left." His hands fidgeted, calluses catching the light, a mirror to Mike's own. "Looking for a job?" Mike asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Jake swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, Frank. He's a shell now, screaming at shadows." Mike clapped his shoulder, a lifeline in a single touch. "You're here now, that's what counts." Jake's breath shuddered out, relief breaking through years of quiet endurance, and Mike welcomed him in. Another soul reclaimed from Frank's wreckage. As Mike soared, Frank's world crumbled. Not in a flash, but a slow, agonizing bleed. It started with whispers, customers drifting away, their cars no longer crowding the lot. Frank shrugged it off, muttering, "They'll be back," his voice hollow with denial. Then mechanics quit. First Pete, then Lou, their footsteps echoing in the empty bays as Frank raged, slamming doors, hurling insults at the walls. "Ungrateful bastards," he'd shout, but deep down he knew. He'd built his kingdom on underpaying good men, on treating loyalty as a leash, and now the chains snapped. The phones fell silent, the lot a graveyard of rust and regret. The final blow came like a guillotine. His biggest client, a luxury rental company with a fleet of high-end cars, canceled their contract. Mike watched from his lot as their convoy rolled past Frank's shuttered doors and into Carter's Custom Repairs, tires crunching gravel like a death knell. A for sale sign went up the next week. Frank's empire, dead. A tombstone to his own arrogance. One evening, as Mike locked up, a shadow lingered in the dusk. Frank, shoulders slumped, hands buried deep in his pockets, his once sharp eyes dulled by defeat. The man who'd barked orders like a king now stood broken, a beggar at the gates of Mike's triumph. "You won," he muttered, voice barely a whisper, the wind carrying it away. Mike studied him, the years between them heavy with unspoken truths, laughter over beers in the early days, promises of partnership that had soured into this. "It wasn't about winning," Mike said, soft but unyielding. "It was about my worth." Frank's throat bobbed, a nod so slow it seemed to cost him everything. Then he turned and faded into the twilight, a silhouette swallowed by his own ruin. Mike didn't call him back, he didn't need to. Frank had learned too late what Mike now lived. Respect isn't a gift. It's a currency, and Mike had invested his wisely. Mike's shop became more than a business. It was a beacon, a sanctuary carved from the ashes of Frank's greed. He hired the overlooked Lou, with his gray beard and steady hands, cast aside by shops chasing youth. Sarah, a single mom with a knack for diagnostics, her quiet strength a mirror to Mike's own. He paid them well, treated them right, built a family where Frank had built a prison. The phone never stopped ringing. His name a whisper among the elite, a roar among the weary. One night, locking up, he found a letter slipped under the door. A scrawled note from a kid he'd trained years ago. Danny, now running his own shop 2 states away. You showed me I could leave, it read. Took years, but I did it because of you. Thank you. Mike tucked it away, a smile tugging at his lips. His ripple was spreading, a tide lifting others as it rose. Let's talk about Danny for a moment. He'd been 16 when Mike met him. A scrawny kid with a chipped tooth and a stutter, dropped off at Carter's Auto Repair by a foster mom who didn't care. Mike saw the spark in him, the way his eyes lit up at a V8's roar, and took him under his wing. Taught him to wield a wrench, to hear an engine's story. Frank had hated it, barked that Danny was a waste of time. But Mike persisted, sneaking him lessons after hours under the flickering shop lights. Danny left at 18, chasing a life beyond the garage, and Mike had wondered if he'd made it. Now the letter answered. Danny's shop thrived, a testament to the seeds Mike had planted in a boy no one else saw. That's the power of seeing worth where others don't. It echoes beyond you, changes lives you'll never witness. Ever had someone like that in your corner? Back at the shop, the days blurred into a rhythm of triumph. Cars rolling in, tools clanking, laughter weaving through the hum. One afternoon, Mike stood under a Porsche's hood, tweaking a turbo with surgical care. When Sarah sidled up, her dark eyes sharp with news. Boss, you hear about Frank? Mike straightened, wrench still in hand. What now? She frowned, wiping her hands on her overalls. He's selling his house, moving out of town. Heard he's drinking himself dry. Mike paused, the words settling like dust. He pictured Frank, once broad-shouldered, commanding, now a shadow drowning in whiskey and regret. He made his bed, Mike said, turning back to the engine, but a pang lingered, not anger, but a quiet sorrow for the man he'd once called brother. Life lesson. You reap what you sow, and Frank's harvest was bitter. The shop's growth didn't stop. 2 new locations sprouted within a year, each a hive of skill and respect. Mike walked the floors, watching his crew, Tommy, Jake, Lou, Sarah, move with purpose, their hands extensions of his own vision. He'd built this not for glory, but for them, for the ones who'd been told they weren't enough. One night, as rain drummed the roof, Jake lingered after closing, beer in hand, the amber bottle catching the dim light. You ever think about going back? He asked, eyes distant. Mike shook his head, leaning against a workbench, the cool metal grounding him. No point in living in a cage you've already escaped. Jake nodded, slow and thoughtful, the rain's rhythm filling the silence. You saved us, you know? Gave us a shot Frank never would. Mike shrugged, but the words settled warm in his chest. Salvation wasn't just his. It was theirs. The rain picked up, a steady thrum against the steel roof, and Mike's gaze drifted to the lot outside, cars gleaming under sodium lights, a testament to the life he'd clawed back from nothing. Jake took a swig, then set the bottle down, his voice dropping low. Heard something else today. Frank's not just selling the house. Word is he's got debts piling up, owes half the town. Guys he borrowed from aren't the forgiving type. Mike's brow furrowed, the image of Frank. Once a titan, now a debtor, twisting something deep inside. He always played fast with money, Mike said. Voice steady but edge with a memory of Frank tossing cash at bar tabs while the crew went unpaid. Guess it caught up. Jake's eyes met his, a flicker of unease there. What if he comes looking for you? Blames you for this? Suspense hung heavy. What would a desperate Frank do when the walls closed in? Mike exhaled, the rain's cadence a mirror to his thoughts. "Let him come," he said, firm but quiet. "I've got nothing left to give him." Jake nodded, but the question lingered, an unanswered shadow in the air. The next morning broke clear, the storm's residue glistening on the pavement as Mike unlocked the shop. Tommy was already there, tinkering with a Maserati, his quick hands a blur of motion. "Boss," he called, grinning over the hood. "Got a call last night. Some hotshot lawyer from the city. Wants you to fix his vintage Jag. Says he'll pay double if you do it personal." Mike raised an eyebrow, a spark of pride flaring. "Double, huh? Tell him I'll take a look." Tommy's grin widened, and Mike felt the weight of his new world settle. Word wasn't just spreading. It was sprinting, carrying his name to places he'd never dreamed of reaching. The Jag rolled in that afternoon, a 1969 E-Type, emerald green and purring with history. Its owner a slick man named Victor, mid-40s, suit sharp as a blade, eyes that weighed everything they saw. "Heard you're the best," Victor said, voice smooth but testing, as he handed over the keys. "She's been stalling, nobody's cracked it. You up for it?" Mike met his gaze, unflinching. "I'll figure it out." Victor smirked, a challenge accepted, and left with a nod. Mike dove in, the car's curves a puzzle begging to be solved. Hours stretched, the shop humming around him. Sarah cursing a stubborn bolt, Lou humming an old tune, Jake welding with a focus that bordered on art. By dusk, Mike found it. A fuel line clog, subtle but deadly, missed by lesser hands. He fixed it, turned the key, and the Jag roared to life, its growl a song of victory. Victor returned the next day, eyes widening as the engine purred like it was new. "Damn," he murmured, circling the car, fingers brushing the hood with reverence. They weren't kidding. He handed Mike a check, double as promised, and leaned in, voice dropping. "I've got clients, big names, bigger wallets. They'll want you. You ready for that kind of heat?" Mike held his stare, the weight of opportunity pressing against his ribs. "I've handled worse," he said, and Victor's laugh was sharp, approving. "Good. You'll hear from me." As the Jag pulled away, Mike felt the ground shift. His world wasn't just growing. It was exploding, and the stakes were climbing fast. What would this mean for the quiet life he'd built? That night, Mike stayed late, the shop empty save for the hum of a single light. He sat at his desk, a battered thing salvaged from the shack, sorting invoices, the numbers a blur of success. A knock rattled the door, sharp and unexpected, jolting him upright. He crossed the floor, boots echoing, and opened it to find Lou, gray hair damp from the evening mist, his face tight with something unspoken. "Mike," Lou said, voice low, "we need to talk." Mike stepped aside, gesturing him in, unease prickling his spine. Lou paced, hands fidgeting, then stopped, eyes locking with Mike's. "Frank showed up at my place last night, drunk, ranting. Said you ruined him, stole his life. He's unhinged." Mike, talking about settling scores. Mike's gut tightened, the air thickening with tension. "What did he say?" Lou swallowed, the lines in his face deepening. Kept muttering about taking back what's his. Didn't make sense, half his words were slurred. "But he's got a look I don't trust. I've seen men like that before, Mike. They don't just fade quiet." Suspense coiled, a dark thread weaving through the triumph. Mike leaned against the desk, arms crossed, mind racing. "He's got nothing left to take," he said, but the words felt hollow. Frank's desperation was a wild card, a storm brewing on the horizon. Lou nodded, slow and grim. "Maybe. Just watch your back, all right?" Mike clapped his shoulder, a silent thanks. But as Lou left, the knock's echo lingered, a warning unanswered. The next week blurred into a frenzy. Victor's clients arrived, cars rolling in like a parade of wealth. A Bentley with a custom paint job, a Porsche 959 that hadn't run in a decade, a Lamborghini Miura that whispered of the 70s. Mike's crew rose to it, hands moving with a precision that bordered on magic, the shop alive with purpose. But the shadow of Frank loomed, a ghost in the corners of Mike's mind. One afternoon, as he wrestled with the Porsche's engine, Sarah sidled up, her dark eyes sharp. "Boss, you hear about the break-in?" Mike straightened, wrenched still. "What break-in?" She frowned, wiping her hands. "Old man Carter's place. Someone trashed it last night. Cops think it's tied to his debts, but folks are whispering he did it himself, staged it for insurance." Mike's jaw tightened, the pieces clicking. Frank, spiraling, grasping at straws. "He's digging his own grave," he muttered, but a chill crept in. What if that desperation turned outward? Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "You think he'd come here?" Mike didn't answer, the question hanging like smoke. That night, he locked up alone, the lot silent under a crescent moon. A crunch of gravel snapped his head up. A figure in the shadows, hunched, swaying. "Frank!" Mike called, voice steady but edged. The figure froze, then shuffled closer. Frank, reeking of whiskey, eyes bloodshot and wild. "You," he slurred, pointing a trembling finger. "You took everything, my shop, my crew, my life." Mike stepped forward, hands up, calm but firm. "You did this to yourself, Frank. You had 30 years to see it." Frank laughed, a jagged sound that broke into a cough, his face twisting with rage and ruin. "You think you're better? Think you're some damn hero? I made you." Mike's voice dropped, cold and final. "You didn't make me. You used me, and I let you, till I didn't." Frank lunged, clumsy and drunk, swinging a fist that Mike dodged with ease. He grabbed Frank's arm, pinning it, the man's breath hot and sour. "Go home, Frank," Mike said, releasing him. "There's nothing left here for you." Frank staggered back, eyes blazing, then stumbled into the night, his curses swallowed by the dark. Suspense pulsed. What would he try next? The encounter rattled Mike, though he hid it well. The next day he called a meeting. Tommy, Jake, Lou, Sarah gathered in the break room, coffee steaming in chipped mugs. "Frank's losing it," he said, voice level but grave. "Came here last night, drunk, swinging. He's not done. Keep an eye out." Lou nodded, grim. "Told you he's off the rails." Sarah crossed her arms, fierce. "Let him try. I've dealt with worse." Jake stayed quiet, but his fists clenched, a silent vow. Mike looked at them, his family, forged in oil and trust, and felt a surge of resolve. "We've built this together," he said. "No one's tearing it down." They nodded, a pact sealed, but the air hummed with tension. Frank was a storm, and storms don't warn before they strike. Days later, a new face rolled in, Maria, a woman in her 50s, gray streaking her hair, driving a beat-up Ford with a blown gasket. "Heard you're the guy," she said, voice rough but warm, her hands calloused like his. "Used to wrench myself, ran a shop, till the bank took it. Frank was my supplier back then. Stiffed me on parts, laughed when I lost everything." Mike's eyes narrowed, a new thread in Frank's tapestry of ruin. "He's got a habit of that," he said, popping the hood. Maria watched, sharp-eyed, as he worked. "You're different," she said after a while. "You see people." He shrugged, but her words stuck. Another life Frank had crushed, another soul finding refuge here. He fixed the Ford, charged her half, and when she left, she slipped him a note. "If you need help, I'm around." A quiet ally, born from shared scars. The shop's rhythm held, but Frank's shadow grew. One morning, Mike arrived to find the lock scratched, toolboxes rifled. Not a break-in, but a message. "He's testing us," Lou growled, fists tight. Mike nodded, jaw set. "Let him. We're stronger." That night, he stayed late, the Ferrari idling outside, a red Sentinel. Headlights flashed. A truck, Frank's old Chevy, creeping past, then peeling away. Mike's pulse quickened, but he didn't chase. Frank wanted fear, and Mike wouldn't give it. Instead, he called Victor. "Trouble brewing," he said, voice low. "Might need a favor." Victor's reply was instant, cool. "Say the word. I've got people." Suspense thickened. Frank's next move loomed, a chess game with no rules. A week later, the storm broke. Mike was alone, closing up when glass shattered, the front window exploding inward, a brick skidding across the floor. He spun, heart hammering, as Frank staggered in, a crowbar in hand, eyes wild with a madness that chilled the air. "You think you're untouchable?" Frank roared, swinging the bar, missing Mike by inches. Tools clattered as Mike ducked, adrenaline surging. "Frank, stop!" he shouted. But Frank charged again, the crowbar arcing toward him. Mike sidestepped, grabbed a wrench and parried, the clang of metal on metal ringing like a bell. "You've lost it," Mike growled, shoving him back. Frank stumbled, panting, then laughed. A hollow, broken sound. "Lost it? You took it." Headlights flooded the shop, Jake's truck screeching to a halt. He burst in, Lou and Sarah behind, tools in hand. "Back off, Frank," Jake yelled, stepping between them, his frame taut with fury. Frank froze, crowbar slipping, the fight draining as he saw the wall of defiance. Mike's crew, unyielding. "You're done," Lou said, voice like gravel. Frank's eyes darted, wild, then dimmed, the crowbar clattering to the floor. He sank to his knees, head in hands, a man unmade. Mike exhaled, the wrench heavy in his grip. "Get out," he said, quiet but final. Frank rose, stumbling into the night, a shadow swallowed by his own collapse. The crew stood silent, the air thick with victory and cost. Cops came, took statements, hauled the brick away. Vandalism, they said, but Mike knew it was more. Frank's last gasp, a desperate swing at a life he'd lost. The shop buzzed the next day, whispers of the night spreading, but Mike kept them focused. Cars needed fixing, lives needed building. Victor called, voice clipped. "Heard about your trouble. My people can make it disappear, say the word." Mike paused, then declined. "He's finished. Let him fade." Victor chuckled. "Your call, but you've got friends now, Carter. Use them." Mike hung up, the weight of allies a new armor. Frank vanished. Rumors said he'd left town. A broken man chased by debts and ghosts. Mike's world steadied, the shop a fortress of purpose. One evening, Maria returned, her Ford purring smooth. "Heard about Frank," she said, leaning against the counter, eyes sharp. "You stood tall, takes guts." She slid him a card, her old shop's name scratched out, a new one written. Maria's Mobile Fixes. "Starting over," she said, grinning. "You showed me it's not too late." Mike smiled, tucking the card away. Another ripple, another life lifted. The shop grew, 3 locations now, a brand whispered in awe. Tommy took lead at one, Jake at another, their trust in Mike a mirror to his own. One night, alone under the shop's lights, Mike found Danny's letter again, its edges worn from reading. He thought of the kid, stuttering, eager, a spark he'd fanned into a flame. Then Maria, Sarah, Lou, lives he'd touched, not by chance but by choice. Here's a truth. Your worth isn't just yours. It's a light you pass on, a fire that warms others if you let it. Ever sparked that in someone? The shop wasn't just steel and oil. It was a legacy, a proof that value, once claimed, multiplies. Frank had taught him that, in the cruelest way, by losing everything, he'd shown Mike what to build. The weeks rolled on, the shop a heartbeat of its own. Cars in, cars out, laughter weaving through the clang of tools. One afternoon, a kid showed up, 17, lanky, oil-stained jeans, clutching a resume in trembling hands. "Name's Eli," he said, voice cracking. "Heard you give chances. I'm good with engines. Taught myself." Mike saw Danny in him, Tommy too, the hunger, the need for someone to believe. "Show me," he said, handing him a wrench. Eli dove into a Chevy, hands steadying as he worked, and by day's end, Mike clapped his shoulder. "You're in." Eli's grin split his face, a new thread in the tapestry Mike wove. A tapestry of second chances, of worth reclaimed. Have you ever faced a choice that rewrote your life or someone else's? Share it below, Your story could be the spark someone needs today. Mike leaned against his Ferrari, the sunset bleeding red across the horizon, a mirror to the fire he'd reclaimed. He pulled an old photo from his pocket. Him and Frank, decades ago, grease-smeared and grinning, the world still wide open. Back then, they'd been brothers in arms, dreaming of a garage that would outlast them. For 30 years, Mike had believed he was tethered to that dream, a prisoner of loyalty to a man who'd forgotten him. Now, standing in the glow of Carter's custom repairs, he saw the truth. His chains had been self-forged, broken the moment he walked away. His shop wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a sanctuary where hard work was revered, where no one was told they were too old, too worn, to matter. He traced the photo's edges, the boy he'd been staring back. A kid who'd traded racing dreams for a wrench, who'd thought survival meant settling. Frank had risen on Mike's shoulders, never once looking down to see the man holding him up. Now Mike's empire stood taller, built not on greed, but on a truth Frank never grasped. True wealth flows from valuing yourself and those around you. As a cosmic law, respect begets abundance. Neglect sows ruin. Frank's empty lot was proof. A ghost town where engines once sang. Mike's lot, a chorus of power, a testament to what happens when you dare to claim your worth. Where in your life have you settled for less than you deserve? The news caught wind, studio lights glaring as an anchor's voice cut through. Tonight, a tale of perseverance and triumph. Mike Carter, a man who rose from 30 years of shadows to build an empire. The screen flickered to an interview. Mike seated, calloused hands folded. His face lined with years but lit with a quiet confidence. When I left Carter's auto repair, he began, voice steady as steel. I had no plan, just a fire I couldn't ignore. I knew I was worth more. 30 years. Never missed a shift. Never left a job half done. And they called me replaceable. He paused, eyes piercing the lens. But no one sets your value but you. The interviewer leaned in, captivated. And now? She asked. Mike's smile was real, forged in trials. Now I run the city's top shop. My crew paid well, treated right. Most of them, they worked for Frank too once. The camera panned to Carter's custom repairs. A hive of activity, Ferraris gleaming, mechanics moving with purpose. A stark contrast to Frank's abandoned husk. I lost 30 years learning that lesson. Mike's voiceover rang out. Don't let anyone dim your worth. The segment ended, the anchor nodding solemnly. A reminder. Know your value, or someone else will price it for you. Mike hadn't expected the aftermath. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages flooding in from strangers, old friends, souls touched by his stand. One email stopped him cold. A young mechanic from across the country. I was you, underpaid, unseen. Your story gave me the guts to quit today. Thank you. Mike read it thrice, a lump in his throat. This wasn't just his victory, it was theirs. What's your worth to you? Have you ever walked away from a place that didn't see you? Drop your story in the comments. Let's honor the fights that shape us, the moments that make us whole. At Daily Narrated Stories, we thrive on these truths, tales of grit, of reclaiming what's yours. Mike's ripple became a tide. His shop grew, 2 more locations sprouting, a brand born from one man's defiance. He hired the forgotten, gray-haired mechanics cast aside, young blood hungry for fairness. He made sure they never felt the sting he'd known, because he'd walked that road and vowed no one else would under his roof. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mike grabbed his keys and slid into the Ferrari. The same red beast that had silenced Frank, a symbol of his rebirth. The engine growled, a pulse of freedom, and he drove, not away, but toward something greater. The highway stretched endless, wind whipping past, and he thought of where he'd begun. 30 years in a garage that never saw him, a paycheck that mocked his effort, a boss who'd priced his soul at nothing. Now the world knew his name, his worth a beacon blazing bright. The Ferrari wasn't the prize, it was the key, unlocking a life where he'd never be replaceable again. Mike's story isn't just inspiring, it's a wake-up call, sharp and urgent. How many of us linger in jobs, relationships, lives where we're undervalued, afraid to leap because the fall feels too steep? His journey proves it. Age doesn't limit you, fear does. Experience isn't a burden. It's a blade, honed by years, ready to carve something new. One step through doubt and doors swing wide. Opportunities evolve. Success waits for those who claim it. Mike didn't just build a garage. He built a movement, a testament to the power of knowing you're enough. Where's your next step taking you? Toward fear or freedom? If you believe real success lies in owning your value, hit that subscribe button now. Join daily narrated stories, where justice isn't a whisper, it's a roar. Share this if it shook you, if it lit a fire. Time's fleeting, and someone out there needs this spark today. Your voice, your fight, your triumph. It starts here with us. Let's keep these stories alive, because at Daily Narrated Stories, we don't just tell tales, we ignite revolutions. Don't wait, subscribe, comment, act. The road's open and it's yours to take.